Welcome, friends. It's another episode of the on.net live show. And if you've tuned in before, you know what this is all about. We are here to empower you, the .net community, to achieve more. I'm your familiar host, Scott Addie, with co-hosts Myra Wenzel and David Pine.
Hi, friends.
We are stoked to have today's guest on the show, Rocky Lhotka. Rocky, I'll hand it over to you briefly to introduce yourself, and then we can go into the subject for the show today.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm currently the VP of Strategy at a company called Xspirit, although we're doing a branding change, so we're going to be called Zebia soon. But I've been in the industry a long time, and over the last 28 years, I've been an open source creator, and we'll probably talk about that more. I've worked in a lot of different industries, manufacturing and finance and all sorts of stuff. Just really love building software and solving, figuring out business problems and figuring out how to solve parts of them with software and that sort of thing. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for sharing that. And I'm always curious for folks that have been in the industry for a while, how did you get your start with .NET? What was it that led you to the technology?
Well, I started my career as a DEC VAX programmer. A lot of people have never heard of Digital Equipment anymore, but at the time they were the number 2 computer maker in the world. But then in the early 90s, I guess, the PC thing was starting to actually catch on in a real way. And I got to say, I was uninterested in PCs because they didn't have any what at the time was considered modern things like virtual memory, and it was just a whole different world from the VAX or Unix offerings of the time. And then Windows NT shows up, and Visual Basic pretty much more or less at the same time. And so Windows NT, for those that don't know, is actually created largely by the same person, David Cutler, that created the VMS operating system for the VAX. And so it had virtual memory and all the modern, then modern operating system concepts. Visual Basic was one of several competing offerings at the time, but turned out to be a practical way, because back then to do a C++ hello world was several pages of code, just tons of ceremony. And Visual Basic was literally one line of code, and so it's like, okay, here we go. Now these PC things have a real operating system and a practical, productive way to build software. So let's go. And that's how I got into the Microsoft world. You roll forward then to the end of the decade, and it had become impossible to deploy software because of DLL hell, which kind of doesn't exist anymore, thankfully, but it did at the time. It was a huge thing. And so everybody, was struggling with that, and Java shows up as an alternative, and I'm like, oh man, and the web too, but I'm like, man, am I going to have to switch to Java just to, remain relevant? And luckily Microsoft comes out with this .NET thing. It had some other names in pre-releases, but and saved me from switching, entire tech stacks. And so that's how I got into the .NET world.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that experience. As I said, I'm always interested in what led folks to this technology that we're focused on this show. But shifting gears. So today, I know that you had planned to cover the topic of CSLA with us. So I think that's where we want to start this conversation. Let's start off with what this thing is and why our audience would care.
So CSLA is this open source project that I've been working on since 1996, 97, I think. So back in the 90s, and this is a little less problematic today because I think, but anyway, back in the 90s, the primary way of doing demos, and this was not just Microsoft, although they were guilty too, but it was PowerSoft, Microsoft, Gupta, SQL Windows. Basically, all the marketing people would get up on stage and say, hey, we've got this really great, highly productive tool. We can aim it at a database and drag and drop a few things onto a screen and hit F5 and you're done, and magic happens. And it was pretty magical, right? You got to admit, right? That whole rapid application development tooling and all that stuff was amazing. However, my question, because my entire background has been building really complicated business apps, things with lots of business rules and just complicated stuff, which is what's fun. And but my question was always, okay, that was a great demo. Now, where does the business logic go? And there would just be a lot of hand waving. They're like, well, it could go in the database. It could go, blah, 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 somewhere. And, so my thought is, okay, you've got this great set of tooling to talk to the database, this great set of tooling to build user experiences. And there should be some sort of great way to build and maintain business logic. Because those are like the three big components of any business app, right? Data, UI, and business logic. And so, that was back in the 90s. And so I created at the time some books that had in it this code that was released. This was before open source was a big thing. So it was freeware or shareware. Basically what we now think of as open source. Anyway, the point is, it's a way of creating and maintaining reusable business logic that keeps good, clean separation from your data access technology, because that seems to change like all the time. And also good, clean separation from your UI technology, because that also seems to change all the time. And so then as .NET was being developed at Microsoft, I was writing and rewriting over and over this CSLA framework to take advantage of the new things that .NET offered, which was very exciting. And it was a 2000 through 2002, I think, very big learning experience for me. And ultimately came out with the .NET version. If I had to do it over again, I would have used a cool code name. But you got to think back when I started this thing in the 90s, everything had an acronym. And really the only thing I missed out on is that it does not have an X. It should have had an X in the name.
So you've had 27 years to think about it. What would you name it then now? Like, what would be your trendy name for the thing?
Geez.
I'm putting you on the spot.
You are. Dude, I've never really come up with a name. That's it probably would be something out of some old like Sumerian mythology or something.
Nice.
I love old, like Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Sumerian mythology, Egyptian. It's so much cool stuff, and I would have come up with something out of one of those.
Yeah, we have our guest saying, let's not call it X.
Yeah, that's no doubt. That was a trend that's best left in the past for sure.
We do have a question too, not necessarily directly related, but kind of all up with .NET. They're asking if .NET will be valuable in 2024. I have an extreme bias here, so I'll abstain from answering and let our guest here, Rocky. What do you think? Do you think .NET's going to be valuable in 2024?
I do. and although I try to keep my biases in check, I've in my career have ridden several trends up and down, and have been pretty fortunate that I've made lucky calls, good calls,
Yeah.
to switch platforms, before it collapsed. And but I don't see .NET collapsing. Actually, I think if you look at the different trend charts from TOB and or TIO, however that's said, and GitHub and others, C# remains strong and maybe even is growing a little bit. I think that's because Microsoft is so aggressively making it work really well in the cloud. I think with Blazor, they're making it really work well in the web in ways that are pretty innovative. And in fact, over the last few years, have been driving some nice competitive changes in some of the JavaScript frameworks also. And that goes both ways, right? The competition of ideas is awesome.
Absolutely.
And I'm personally pretty bullish on the long-term prospects for a technology called WebAssembly, both on the client, but even more so on the server. And Microsoft is really deeply engaged in making sure that .NET works very well in the WebAssembly ecosystem. And I mean, I could be wrong, but I suspect that 5-10 years from now, most software will actually compile targeting WebAssembly, not any native. We will look back on all of these, kind of like how today we look back on the mainframe era. I think in the future people will look back and go, man, they used to compile to actual hardware architecture. Oh my God, so I'm covering a lot of ground here. In short, I think specifically because of Blazor, WebAssembly, and the cloud support, that .NET remains and continues to be incredibly viable.
And there are some other sources too. One that you didn't mention that I recall standing out to me personally was Stack Overflow. They do an annual developer survey, and I don't know if this is an accurate number, but like 90,000 developers or something like that. So it's a pretty big swath, which is nice.
One thing that is interesting, like on the TOB index that Rocky was mentioning, is that I like the headline. They have a December headline saying that C# on its way to become programming language of the year 2023. So I think probably is from the top languages seeing most growth in the past year. So it's great to see that. So that's interesting.
And then we did have someone jumping more specifically towards the topic here. They're saying, what is CSLA and why would they use it?
Yeah, so in short, CSLA, the tagline we use is it's a home for your business logic. It is an object-oriented model, so similar to creating a UI, so you inherit from one of several base classes in order to tap into the business rules engine in different ways. And the business rules engine in the biggest base class, I guess, does a whole lot of things. So it supports authorization rules at a type level, like is the current user allowed to create, view, edit this particular type of domain object. And you got to keep in mind, these are not entities. This is not an ORM. These are domain objects in an object-oriented sense, or domain-driven design sense, maybe. So, can you interact with the type in certain ways? And then the next level down is at a property level. So for each individual property, is the current user allowed to see the value? Are they allowed to change the value? And then that's true at a method too. Are they allowed to call a method? So these are all different authorization rules. Then there are validation rules. So which can be arbitrarily complex, right? They can be as simple as this is a required field, or whatever. But they could be as complex as to say, well, if these other three values in the domain type or object are some set of values, then this one is can only be less than 100 or something. And so it's and then there are rules that mutate data. So when you change one property, it changes this other property. So you can do calculations, and so the idea is that the rules engine is hopefully arbitrarily powerful. Certainly, and again, this is open source, so an awful lot of the rules engine, I wrote the base of it. A gentleman named Johnny Beckham from Norway really put a lot of energy into this thing. Because at the time he was building some software to run a very large bank. And so this is the way I always phrase it. It's like, we know for a fact that the rules engine can handle all the rules necessary to run a complete bank. So it's like, okay, that, fairly complicated stuff. So
that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, right.
And it's not running on Fortran. So that's right. Old banking software, right? Yeah. Awesome. So I'm still a little taken aback by the fact that you said it's been evolving for 27 or 28 years. What did some of the initial iterations look like then? I'm curious, so that's before .NET, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So what was that written in?
Originally, it was written primarily in Visual Basic.
Okay.
And it really, ultimately, and I'm looking for a demo here because I've got a request to show a demo. So, but I'm gonna.
I just suggested that if you have anything on your machine that would help us visualize, I think that would be super helpful for the audience, and the community that is watching can let us know as well.
Right. No, I hear you. So I'm hopefully find one that is in a currently running state, because of course I'm always working on these things, right?
Or your repo, to show the repo where the code is.
That would be easy. That would be easy enough. So let's do that. Now see, I lost the thread. What was the question?
Sorry.
We were talking about the original version VB of.
Oh, that's right. So, so originally I did not set out to write a rules engine. Originally I was working. This was in probably 95, I think. I was working with a bunch of guys, a different team at the company I worked at, that were using a tool called Forte, which is a C++, or was a C++ preprocessor to build client-server distributed systems. And today, this is drop dead simple, right? We build them all the time. But back then, most client-server system projects failed because people had to write their own network protocols. And I mean, the world was very primitive prior to 1996, 97. And but they were writing this big, literally globally distributed system. They had had a concept of mobile objects, so objects could move from server to client and back to the server. And some of that was bouncing off satellites to get around the globe. And I'm like, man, I want to write software that bounces off satellites. That would be freaking awesome. And Microsoft at the time had come out with this thing called remote OLE automation, and which then became DCOM, which then got rolled into COM+. But I'm like, oh, this is the technology that allows Microsoft developers to, bounce things off satellites. And so I started writing this thing to do distributed, mobile objects using what ultimately became COM+. And that was my goal, and it succeeded. And CSLA still has all that capability in it. But then what happened after people started using it is they're like, okay, that's cool, but how do we get this, how do we manage the business logic that now is encapsulated in these domain types? And so then over the years, what's primarily grown is this rules engine to get more and more powerful. So
So does CSLA, you said that's an acronym, and I may have missed this before, but did you spell out what that is? It doesn't stand for C sharp, LA something, right?
No, well, it's and this kind of falls flat now too. But back in the day, let's see, that's what I want, I think. Back in the day, acronyms were a big deal, and then so it stood for component-based scalable logical architecture, because back in the COM days, everything was a component, right? And similar to SOAP, if anybody remembers, SOAP stood for Simple Object Access Protocol.
Yep.
And then as time went on, the technology and the kind of the world changed. And so SOAP quit being an acronym and just became a word, because Simple Object Access Protocol no longer reflected what it was. And the same is true with CSLA. I don't even think of it as an acronym anymore. It's just a brand that I'm kind of stuck with.
So Jason Bach, it's an acronym that doesn't matter anymore.
Yes. Yeah. Hey, Jason, did you hear me talk about the vax? He and I have this back and forth about that. So anyway, here's the GitHub site, and in the GitHub site, there's a bunch of information, links to all sorts of stuff, where people can go and find more information. If you can't remember the GitHub site, you can also go to CSLAnet.com, which is the homepage for the project. But really, pretty much everything's on the GitHub site, because it is, after all, an open source project, right? And in here, there is a samples directory. And so there's a whole bunch of samples showing how to use CSLA to build apps that have Blazor UIs or MVC or MAUI. We still support Windows Forms and WPF. Just now, we're actually dropping Xamarin in favor of MAUI in the version 8 release, which is what we're working on now.
So then, out of curiosity, sorry, I was just gonna say, you said version 8. So are you synchronizing then with like the major releases of .NET? Is that the idea?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, I try, and
Awesome.
Thus far we've been successful, pretty close. We use semantic versioning, so I'll try to keep all the breaking changes so that they end up in a major release and enhancements in point releases and so forth. And so far we've managed to keep everything, which is sometimes painful. Because there were, for example, in 6 there were some things that needed to be changed, and we stuck with it and waited till 7. But really, it would have been nice to do the breaking changes earlier to fix some issues. But you do what you got to do, I guess.
I wanted to dig into something that Rocky mentioned a bit earlier. This was described as being a business rules engine that is capable of running a bank. And I was hoping we could provide sort of a concrete example for the viewers of just here's an example of something that rules engine could help you with. Can you think of something from your experience where this has really helped save some time and solve a problem?
Well, I think the big thing is that CSLA strongly encourages or supports the idea of separation of concerns. And so, because people might roll their eyes and go, well, geez, I've written complicated software using, Windows Forms, WPF, MVC, whatever. I didn't need a framework to do it, which is all true. Absolutely, people write amazing software all the time, right? But what happens more often than not is that once you've written your software using a particular UI technology, you will never move off that UI technology. So there are people maintaining massive Windows Forms apps, and they will never move off. It's a rewrite because because they didn't have separation of concerns, because business rules were not a first-class construct, like a form or a page is a first-class construct, right? Or a data reader, or whatever. All these, we've got first-class constructs for the presentation layer and for data access. But where does the business logic go? Well, it usually goes in a button click event or in a controller or a view model. And all of those things are inherently tied to the UI. And so you're trapped. You're never getting off that particular technology. And also, most enterprise business apps last 15 to 20 years. Right. I mean, a short-lived one might be 7 years, but I mean, most of them are somewhere between 10 and 20 years. And so how many UI technologies do we go through in a 20-year period? I mean, just stop and think about that, right? Windows Forms is actually exceptional because it has not changed in any meaningful way since 2005. But that's the exception, man. By and large, things come and go, especially, as the web matured and became a thing, since 2010. We've gone through, just pick a noun, add JS to it, and you've got a UI framework, right? And and even I don't know, it's craziness, right? And so you kind of have to view the UI as an expendable piece of your app, something that you're going to replace in like 5 years, because the technologies will have changed, and you're going to have to throw it away and recreate it. And that's true kind of at the data layer too, because Microsoft and the Java world, nobody can figure out how we want to talk to relational databases. So every time you turn around, there's a new way to talk to the database, right? And what I've always found is that your business logic, what you actually are trying to solve does not change that fast, right? If you're an insurance company, you have customers, you offer a set of products that have a set of risks and pricing and whatever else. That stuff doesn't change every 5 years, right? It probably evolves slowly over decades, but and so why is it that we're rewriting our business logic from scratch just because the UI technology of the day is different from what it was 5 or 10 years ago? And so that's the value of CSLA, is to say, hey, I can take what all those rules, all that authorization, all that validation, all that calculation that I would have put in a button click event or would have put into a controller, and I can put it in a separate layer of code that is neutral in terms of UI. And so if I need to tear off the UI and replace it, I'm not saying that's free or effortless. It's a lot of work, right? But I don't need to rewrite and revalidate, retest all of my business logic, because I've got all of that in a set of rules. One thing that we can show here probably is, and these are simple rules, but like here's a rule that just count, as one text property changes, it outputs a different property with the count of characters in that field.
Can we zoom in a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
There we go.
Mm-hmm.
And the point here is all of the rules, and this concept actually comes from a book called Object Thinking, written by a guy named David West, which I still think is a really good book. But in his book, he talked about this idea of what he called self-evaluating rules, but a rule that is a class. And so this is the model that CSLA follows. So you say, well, I've got a rule. It's going to inherit from, really what it does is it implements iBusiness rule or iAuthorization rule. But we've got some base classes to make life easier, right? In your constructor, you typically say, I'm going to bind this rule to a primary property. It might affect other properties. And then you implement an execute or an execute async method. And in here, you are provided with some context. And so I can use that context to get at the primary property value, retrieve its length, and then I can add an output value with the count. Right. And again, this is super simple, but you can imagine, this might be a rule that implements your entire pricing structure and discount structure for your product catalog, or is calculating, maybe it calls a microservice that does all sorts of complicated calculations around insurance premiums, or arbitrarily complex stuff, and of course can affect multiple output properties and so forth, not just within one domain object, but within what's called an object graph. So you think, in real apps, you've got, let's say, an invoice, and an invoice has line items, and the line items have detail items, and the detail items have, right, all of that combined is what's called an object graph. And so the rules engine allows you to manipulate properties and domain objects within the object graph.
And you also have been updating to the newest templates that we have in .NET. So I see that, like you mentioned, that you're going to upgrade to Xamarin, the Xamarin to Maui. Do you also plan to do like the new Blazor template that we have in .NET 8 and things like that?
Yep. So by and large, we've support a new technology pretty close to when it comes out. So we've been supporting Maui and Xamarin both for quite a while. We're just planning to drop Xamarin at this point, because again, it's open source, and so there's only so much bandwidth that people are able to put into maintaining all this stuff, right? And of course, we've been supporting Blazor. Blazor's amazing. Especially, there's a whole bunch of CSLA that we haven't really talked about, because another thing CSLA does is these base classes. If we go back, I'm all zoomed in here. Let's see. This is a domain type that I can't zoom anymore, I guess. But just does simple editing of some person data. So it inherits from a class called business base. Business base brings in the entire rules engine, because the assumption is now we're creating a domain type that does everything, right? And so if we go down here, we can see that it has a required attribute, and you might say, oh, well, that's just a required attribute like I can use out of .NET, right? And that's true. But this is a perfect way to illustrate what CSLA does for the UI developer, because those data annotations attributes came into being in .NET 3.5. And so technologies like web forms, like Windows Forms, and like WPF didn't even know they existed. And so there's zero support for these attributes in those technologies. And even today with Blazor, there's only support if you're inside of what's called an edit form. If you're not using the edit form technology in Blazor, the required attribute is completely ignored. Well, that's horrible, right? Because the idea, the idea behind a business rule, and this includes validation, is that I know for a fact that it's going to be implemented, right? It's going to happen. And so what CSLA does is it picks up these attributes and adds them into the CSLA rules engine. So even if you're in Windows Forms, which is now, we would think ancient and crufty, this still works. Right? And if I come down a little bit further, I've actually got a method called add business rules. And in here, I'm adding a whole bunch of rules that say, okay, I want some informational text. So, because another piece of the rules engine is that there can be broken rules. It's like an error, but you can also have a warning or information. And so I'm saying, okay, there's some information here that says the person, I can't wrap either, because I'm in GitHub. The person name is required. I'm checking the case of, I want to make sure the first letter is uppercase, but that's actually a warning rule because some people do have names where their first letter is not uppercase. Because this is a demo and it works really good on stage. There's a rule that says you can't have a Z in your name. It makes it easy to just, but that makes it go into an error state. And then we were looking at that letter count rule that adds up the count of the letters. And again, I guess I didn't close the loop on this. All of these rules, because they are classes, they can be unit tested independent of where they're being used in the app, right? So if I have, for example, a rule that checks postal codes, I can have an entire set of unit tests that make sure that rule does exactly what I want around postal code checking. And maybe I start building the app in the US, and so I'm checking for US style postal codes. And then what happens, and it's literally what's happening here, is we're attaching, like this check case rule is being attached to the name property. Well, I can use check case on any property and in any domain class, right? And I can make sure I'm comfortable that check case actually works because I've unit tested the heck out of it, right? And so I just attach it where I need it, and I have confidence that it's going to work. And to go back to the postal code, so maybe I expand into the UK, totally different postal code scheme. So I enhance my postal code rule to support that scheme and write unit tests around it. And so now I have confidence that I am going to be able to work in the US and the UK, right? And I don't have to change my UI or data layer necessarily. I'm able to change my business layer to make sure all of that works.
And Ronald got a question here. Should the rules engine interact directly with entity framework, or should I create a separate repository layer?
I personally am a believer in separation of concerns. And so I keep my data access layer separate. Mm-hmm. And CSLA strongly supports that. So in fact, if we go down here a little bit, CSLA does have this concept, like I talked about before, of mobile objects. So objects can literally, the object graph can move from client to server, from server to client. And this is done inside of CSLA through a construct called a data portal. And the data portal, in an abstract way, understands how to create, read, update, insert, delete, and execute arbitrary methods. And so it was CRUD, create, read, update, delete. But it turns out that in a distributed setting, often you need to just run arbitrary code on the server. So we added the ability to execute, and it went from CRUD to CRUD. Yeah, whatever. At least some people smiled.
Yeah, I got that. That's fine.
The point being, so here's the fetch method. And you can see that we're passing in the ID of the person that we want to fetch, but then we're injecting the data access layer. And this data access layer is an iPerson DAL, right? So I don't know how it's implemented, and frankly, I don't care. I'm going to get my data. I'm going to map the data into my domain type, and then I'm going to run my business rules. And people might look at that and go, man, that data mapper, isn't there a thing in the world called AutoMapper? Shouldn't I be using AutoMapper? Or maybe I hate all of the mappers. So this is an order of events thing. So data mapper, CSLA, is one of the oldest Microsoft open source projects in existence, and also is one of the oldest .NET ones in existence. And to my knowledge, it predates AutoMapper. So back in the day, I wrote my own. Now today, I probably would have said, why would I write my own? I can use AutoMapper. And you can. There's nothing stopping you. The other thing is that if you say, man, I hate all that mapping stuff, that's magic, it's horrible, it's evil, that's fine. You can right here, you can just manually copy the values out of your entity type into your domain type. But to come back to the person's question, maybe I'll implement that data access layer using Entity Framework because I like Entity Framework. Maybe I don't. Personally, I tend to use an open source framework called Dapper, D-A-P-P-E-R, which is a lightweight ORM, and I like that quite a bit. For the longest time, I avoided ORMs completely, and I would write everything by hand using ADO, just raw ADO.net, and because that's still the fastest, right? All these abstraction layers are nice, but they add performance impacts too, right? So anyway, the point being, CSLA doesn't care how you talk to your database. You typically would wrap it behind some sort of repository pattern or whatever pattern you want to use.
And there was a follow-up question about that. Let me see here. So instead of the DAL, can they have the DB context instead coming into there? But I guess to your point, the iPerson DAL is the abstraction, right? And then it would be implemented by the context from EF.
Yeah, right. I mean, what you don't want to do is mix business rules into your data access layer, because even Entity Framework over time keeps changing, often in ways that are not backward compatible, right? And so you don't want to have business logic tied into your entities or your contexts at that level, because you got to figure every few years you're going to have to throw that layer away and replace it too. And so again, you want to keep separation of concerns. So there's zero business logic in the UI, and there is zero business logic in your data access layer. That is the goal. So if I look back at the project here, in fact, you can see, so I've got the client. This is the Blazor client project. I've got an app server. I've got the shared logic. So this is a DLL that compiles and deploys to the client and to the server, because in this particular case, this client is WebAssembly, although it could be either way. But then I've got my abstract data access layer with the interfaces, and then I've got an implementation that's a mock in memory, and then I've also got an implementation using Entity Framework. And so if we look at Entity Framework, I do have my DB context, and then I've got my implementation of iPerson DAL, and notice that this is using dependency injection. So I'm injecting the context here into the data access layer. So the business layer is completely oblivious, right? It just asked for an instance of iPerson DAL, which came from dependency injection. Well, the iPerson DAL that I'm using in this case requires a DB context, and so it gets that, and then I can use that to do all of my actual talking to the database, right? So it keeps.
And then it's since it's abstracted away as an interface, then you can replace that and then unit test it. And
yes, that's exactly right. Yep. So you can unit test your Entity Framework level. Where am I? There we go. I went up one level. So in a lot of my samples, in fact, most of them, I actually do implement a in-memory database, like a mock, where my database is literally just some lists. I like this for demos because people can just download the code and then run it without having to set up a database, right? However, I do like it for real life too, because one of the hardest problems for integration testing is, how do I get my database reset to a known start point in order to test all my app, right? and have, although it's work, I'm not pretending like it's not, right, to maintain a entity framework and a mock data access layer. I often find that it's worth it because my in-memory database layer always, every time it gets instantiated, it starts at the same known point, right? So I can have a real fast and easy way of doing integration tests that can be harder to do. Now, Entity Framework these days actually does allow you to do an in-memory model as well. So that is also a viable way of creating a mock database for testing, is to use the Entity Framework in-memory model. But
yeah, you just gave me some flashbacks to earlier in my career and trying to like wipe databases and re-up them, and it's just like, integration testing is not fun.
It is not.
We had a question earlier in the chat. I'm struggling to find it, but it was asking about .NET 7 and .NET 8 support. What's the status there?
So we've supported .NET 7 since .NET 7 came out. And CSLA 7 runs in .NET 8 just fine. And but the big thing that we are working on, and Maira mentioned this, is the new templates for Blazor. And in fact, it's not even the templates. That's not the problem. Blazor 8. Well, so let's be clear. So CSLA 7 works great in Windows Forms, WPF, Razor Pages, Maui. You're all good. Use .NET 8. In Blazor 8, Microsoft introduced this new set of render modes, which are magical, and which I think are aspirational and not complete. And so you will rapidly discover with most Blazor apps that I have that as soon as you turn on these new render modes, your app will crash. And that's because almost every Blazor page now renders on the server and then renders again on the client. And most of us have written code kind of assuming that we're rendering inside the Blazor model. Yeah, magical looks great in demo. Absolutely right. But it is magical, and I want to make sure we fully enable it with CSLA because it is freaking awesome. But the key here is that right now CSLA doesn't have the code to detect that it's rendering on the server and then rendering in Blazor. And that's a bad way to put it. So because Blazor can now render on the server, you're running in Blazor, but you're not running in like the full Blazor environment with dependency injection and everything. It doesn't all work the way you think it would. And then your page renders again inside of Blazor like it did before. And so, and I've written some blog posts about this because it ties in. There's two aspects to this. One is state management across pages in your app in Blazor 8 doesn't work at all unless you take extra steps to make it happen. And then the second thing is that in Blazor 6 and Blazor 7, the way we got at the user identity is through something called a state provider, authentication state provider, and that is no longer universally available. It was universally available. In fact, it was the only way to get at the current user. But now you have to be dual mode. So you have to go, oh, no, I don't yet have that authentication state, so I need to get the user from HTTP context, which used to be off limits in Blazor, but is no longer. Anyway, I'm maybe digressing. The point is, once we get all that sorted, then we'll release CSLA 8. And this is probably the biggest set of change that's between 7 and 8 is dealing with these new render modes.
One of the other things that comes to mind, this was a major feature in the .NET 8 release, and that was native AOT compliance. Now, if I wanted to use CSLA with native AOT, is there anything that would prevent me from doing that?
Sadly, yes, there is. So CSLA, like an awful lot of other technologies, uses dynamic, uses expression trees and little bits of reflection and a lot of things. in order to do some of its dynamic binding. And none of that works with AOT. And I think as AOT becomes more and more desirable, and the tooling is getting better and more integrated, it's going to put a lot of pressure on tools like Entity Framework and CSLA and others and ultimately the solution is what Jason just says is you got to create source generators because you can't do anything dynamic at runtime and also use AOT.
The irony to Jason stating that is I knew that he was watching, and when I was seeing your code, I saw like the iProperty info and stuff like that, and I know it's reflection based. So I was thinking that Jason should volunteer to write the source generator for CSLA.
I love that idea. Well, and Jason is one of a whole lot, like 60 or 80 people, but he's one of the people that has contributed some really important things to CSLA over the years. So whether he wants to do that, I don't know. But seriously, this is open source, and the reason that it does all the things that it does is because of contributions from a whole lot of people. Jason and Johnny Beckham and Ricky Supit and and it's global. To me, this is one of the most fulfilling parts of this whole thing. Is I have acquaintances and in some case now close friends all over the planet. People that have gotten involved with the project and of course you start out just contributing code or whatever, and sometimes you end up having these long chats and dialogues and get to know each other's families, and I love it. I just love the it takes what seems like this millions and millions of developers globally and kind of makes the world much smaller, because it's like, oh yeah, there's somebody in Perth, Australia that I actually know pretty darn well, that I spent like 2 years working on a feature in CSLA,
and we could see from the comments that you had a pretty supportive fan base there, and people were very thankful for your contributions to the community over the years. So yeah, thank you, Rocky.
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes left, but I had one more question I was thinking of. So let's assume I'm just getting started with CSLA. I've never used this in my app. Are there any guardrails in place, things like analyzers that would send me down the correct path?
Did Jason put you up to that?
Well, no. So I associate Jason with two things. Regions is one. The second is analyzers. And I'm sure I'll be hearing from Jason after this. But
he loves them, right? He loves regions. It's his favorite. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and absolutely is a fan of spaces instead of tabs. That's the other one. So the reason I asked Scott is because yes, CSLA has a really nice set of analyzers, which were written by Jason. That's probably Jason's biggest contribution to the framework. Oh, I don't know. It's either that or from an idea perspective, although he didn't do any of the coding so much, but a lot of the dependency injection and testability, the way that you're able to do testing of different things in CSLA is largely because of pressure from Jason saying, Rocky, you need to be able to test this, in this way or that way. And But to directly answer your question, yes, there's a bunch of analyzers. They're awesome, and so I tell you, because this thing's been around for 27 years, or the .NET version since 2001 or whatever. There are some amazing bits of code in here that were all like using expression trees. I mean, basically, if there's like, man, how do I do this clever thing in .NET? Probably somebody came along with CSLA and said, oh, we could make CSLA better if we use this clever thing in .NET. And some of it I wrote, some of it are being the CSLA code base is kind of a gold mine of really cool stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. Unfortunately, we are at time for the show. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in and listening to the conversation with Rocky. Thank you to Rocky for sharing his expertise and telling us all about CSLA. As a reminder to our viewers, you can check out other live streams like this one focused on .NET over at dot.net/live. And if you were to tune in next week, same day, same time, we'll be joined by guest Tobias Fenster. And the topic of the show will be using containers in both the development environment and in production. If that sounds interesting, please do join us. Until next time, see everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.